My name is Monk Rowe for the Phillies Jazz Archive. I'm very pleased to be chatting today with drummer and producer Bill Goodwin. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, sir. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah. I'm going to start off with I debated about trying this actually. I'm going to. It's a it's a fill in the blank.
Okay.
A career in jazz is.
Um, Hopefully long and profitable. A career in jazz is what I dreamed of from was about 11 years old. And even before I knew what I was dreaming about, and it came together in a strange way while viewing a movie with my mother. It was The Man with the Golden Arm with Frank Sinatra playing. If you know the story, then you know I don't have to explain it. And it featured, I'd been getting into music, West Coast jazz, particularly. I had certain favorites, and they were all in this movie. At some point, there was a big band scene. Sinatra was playing it. Sinatra was a family friend. You know, I grew up in Hollywood, and my father was in showbiz, and my mom was too. And they're friends of Sinatra's who lived in our neighborhood. Well, anyway, and he had a hard time getting going after his big scandal with Ava Gardner. And anyway, my mom, she really liked Frank, and so she takes us to see his movie, and he was very good in it, playing the former junkie drummer who just gets out of jail, decides he wants to be a drummer. It's a Nelson Algren novel, quite Walk on the Wild Side, that guy. So I was struck by the music and seeing and hearing Shelly Manne on the soundtrack. And I just thought to myself, a 12-year-old self, I can do that. I could play the drums. I
You were,
know exactly what he's doing.
you were playing the saxophone at the time, weren't you?
I was playing sax. Yeah, but I was never a good sax player. I could read music, and I could play in the school bands. And I continued that through junior high and high school. I played saxophone and I played drums, depending on the situation. But I went to my first year of high school when I was 14, ninth grade, and I declared myself a drummer.
Your father did a lot of announcing and being involved in some comedy shows. Do you recall as a kid hearing his voice on the television? Doing a Maxwell House commercial or anything like that. What was that experience like?
It was actually radio until I was about 10. There really was no commercial TV per se, and nobody had television sets. I mean, there were very few. And Dad was on the radio, and he was on every week, and it was very well known. And he worked with either Bob Hope before I was born, and then he was working with George Burns and Gracie Allen after I was born, and then he went back to work with Bob Hope, when I was around 8 or 9. And I listened all the time, and I loved both shows and the way he worked. And the early TV with Burns and Allen too. He was just their first season, I think, with them on television, and then he went back to work with Bob Hope, which was strictly radio, NBC.
You were only around 16 when he passed away. Is that correct?
I was 16, yeah.
Did that occurrence affect your education or your choice to start working, or what did it do
Well,
to
it
the
affected
family?
everything because my dad proved that you can take it with you, and because he left us not penniless, but in kind of dire straits. My mom really had to struggle get back on her feet. So we left where we were living. We lived in Palm Springs, California, and he left there and went back to Los Angeles, where he had been up until when I started high school. And I got to LA and just immediately got on the scene there. I was finished my last semester of high school, ended up dropping out before graduation, and but I was hanging out every night and every day, just trying to learn to play. I had a very fortuitous meetings with some people, young musicians my age or slightly older, and they kind of they took me in, and I already well to go back a little bit, I was already knew Stan Levy and I already knew Mel Lewis, where I got to know them pretty quickly on getting back to LA, and Shelly Manne, and they became like my mentors.
Was there an audition piece? I remember in the early 60s, if a drummer could play Wipeout, like, okay, you can be in our garage band. What was there something similar to that back then that you would be expected to be able to do?
Yeah, to play fast bebop.
Fast bebop.
Yeah, I mean, I first met Bobby Hutcherson, and Terry Trotter, the pianist, took me over to Bobby's house to play with Bobby and him and Herbie Lewis, the bass player, and they were a year older than me. And the first thing Bobby said to me after, "Do you have any marijuana?" was, "Can you play fast?" I said, "I don't know. Let's find out." So we played From This Moment On, way, way up. And, I guess I did okay. I really didn't know how to play the drums. I had no technique at all, but I could hear and I could follow music and I could play music, in other words. I just didn't have a solid technique on the drums or any technique on the drums.
It's very fortuitous that you just said I could play music, because in this particular record,
Mhm.
and the fine print inside, Phil Wood says Bill Goodwin plays the music. He didn't say that he plays the drums. He said you play the music.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
I always play the song, and I know most of the songs I play, I know them well. I know the lyrics. I know something about the origin and all that. And I love, like I love books and music, and I like knowing things about them.
What was your reason for coming east?
Gary Burton.
And how does that work? You get a recommendation, somebody recommends you happen to cross paths on Fifth Avenue, or how does that
No,
thing
no.
occur?
Well, I was still living in Los Angeles. It was actually that year that Gary called me to play. I was with George Shearing that year. It was best paying job in jazz, and the guys and all the more you know let's say less commercial jazz groups were all envious of me, and I knew them all because I made twice as much money as they did working with George. But I did, we didn't get to play real hard. I had a lot of brushes, which was good for me. I learned to play the brushes very well, I think. Over the 60s, I had met and hung out a lot with Gary, Steve Swallow, Larry Coryell, Bob Moses. And I liked their music. There was something different. There was only a few. There were only a few what you would call fusion or jazz rock groups, but Gary's one of the only one, but it was one of the more successful ones. And I always liked to go to hear them play whenever I could, and I told them, if you ever need a drummer, try me out. I'd like to know your music, and I'd love to play with you, which is a process that I recommend to all of my student drummers. Find somebody you would want to play with, and let them know. They won't be upset with you.
Oh, that's a great one. I had a question down the road, advice to students, and you just nailed it. Do you ever tell them, be aware of what bass player you're joining?
Absolutely. The bass players have been my, the people that have pushed me forward the most. The first that I can really remember was Red Mitchell, who befriended me when I was about 17. But I already knew, some other people, and I was a jazz bow man. I went to see everybody play. and I got to meet everybody, and I was hanging out at the drum shop every day. And so I was on, I was on the scene. I wanted to be a part of the scene, and I was part of the scene. I just wasn't really a good drummer, but I could say I could play. But it was Stan Levy, the great bebop drummer, who befriended me and just kind of essentially threatened me into becoming a better drummer. Told me that I wasn't that I had a lot of possibilities, but I wasn't making it technically, and I had to practice and get my hands together. And
Did
the
you
way he said it, I don't know if you know about Stan, but he was an ex-boxer from Philadelphia. Big guy, very brutal-looking guy. It was a sweet man, a wonderful guy. But he looked at you in a way, it was like, I'm going to kill you if you don't do what I tell you to do. And I took it to heart. So Stan, I don't want Stan to kill me. So I actually got a practice pad and some big practice sticks and started practicing, my ass off. And during that time, I was working at, my day job was at NBC in Hollywood. I was a parking lot attendant. And and we didn't have to park cars. We just tell people where to go. And so we had the jazz radio on in the office, and I had a practice pad with the sticks, and I practiced all day at work. And
did anybody ever turn
I mean, as they talk about fortuitous circumstances, there's just so many. The one with my sister started dating Terry Trotter, the pianist. Later, they got married. He introduced me to Herbie Lewis and Bobby Hutcherson, who were his best pals. And I was meeting all these other people. Meanwhile, I'm hanging with these guys who were exceptional musicians at their age, just a year older than me. And they really liked me, and they liked me as a friend, and I think they liked me as a player. I played with them a lot up until I started really working more, and everybody started, leaving town, and Bobby moved to New York, and Herbie moved to New York, and Terry got away from playing jazz and because he married my sister and they had kids.
I see.
What about
the early
the bass players?
Rock and roll.
Well, rock and roll was happening when I was already loved West Coast jazz, and Elvis's first records came out. But I used to listen to a lot of rhythm and blues, Fast Domino, and Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and in blues, the Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and all those guys. And they put out singles, but they were considered race records. They hadn't crossed over at that point until later. And I loved that stuff. And I thought Elvis was very good. I really liked him, but he was kind of a shadow of those guys. He wasn't, and he even said that. It's pretty obvious that he was, indebted to all those real, Southern blues singers and rhythm and blues singers.
Yeah, and then
I started buying those records, but I didn't I never really bought Elvis's records. He was on the radio a lot, and I liked some of his stuff. Some of it was very funny too, because it was parodied by guys like Stan Freberg. You know who that was?
Yes. Stan
Freberg did the takeoff on Heartbreak Hotel. He did takeoffs on a lot of people. He did them on Lawrence Welk, but the Heartbreak Hotel was the echo. It says too much echo. And it's like that old spring echo thing, So it's just,
right. And that predated more cowbell.
Oh, absolutely. Why, 3 decades.
Did you reach a point as a young man that you could make a living, live on your own by playing the drums? When did that occur?
I figured out that it was possible, and that's what I wanted to do. So I had this day job at NBC, which my mom would help me get, and I was happy working there. And if you join NBC in a lesser capacity, like the mailroom or the parking lot, you essentially would be in the organization. And then when they found a place that maybe move you up to something more, better in the business. And my dad had worked for NBC for years, so I got hired because the president of NBC told him to hire me because he was friends with my mom. So I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do the job, and I wanted to hang out, and I wanted to play at night, and it went well as far as that goes. But then I got a chance to do an actual record date of rehearsing for a week and then recording a real professional recording session, not just home taping or anything. And I wanted to do it, and they wouldn't let me off to do it, so I quit. And my mom was a little alarmed.
Eddie Burt had
You're going to be able to make
story.
it? I think I'm going to be okay.
Yeah.
By that time, I was 19. I was already getting called to play with a lot of people. I was playing with like bass players like Red and Gary Peacock was a friend, and he really liked my playing because, I was more adventurous than many of the people he played with. And he was, what happened to him.
Can you define adventurous at that point in the West Coast jazz scene?
Well, Ornette Coleman's first record came out, and second record came out when I was still in high school. And I bought them, and I loved them. The reason I bought them was they were on Contemporary Records, which is my favorite label. And I had already got to meet and as a teenager, gotten to meet and play with Art Pepper. And I listened to, Shelly Manne and his men were on that label. And I loved everything on Contemporary Records. I would just get it. And I saw Ornette Coleman on the album with his plastic saxophone. So who's this guy? I got to check it out. And I just fell in love with his music. And so that was where Gary was in that camp. And we played a lot with Dennis Budimir. He's a great guitarist. And we often worked with Bud Shank, who had a regular night at Shelley's Manhole, like an off night, weeknight.
Now, those guys followed the path into the studios, and I'm assuming they made a pretty good living. Did you aspire to that?
Well, Bud was already there. Dennis went there. Dennis Budimir, I don't know if you know him, was a marvelous guitar player, extremely creative, and was an influence on Bill Frisell, according to Bill. Anyway, Bill told me that. We made some records, home recordings that later came out, and Bill, being much younger than us, he heard them when he was young, and he told me once he was extremely influenced by Dennis and those records, which was nice to hear, And so what happened? Oh, it's still a blur. So much was going on. LA was just rife with things to do. Lots of gigs, lots of jam sessions, lots of rehearsals. So, I started making my way, but at 19, I got hired by Terry Gibbs to play with him at, Hollywood on Sunset Strip to Crescendo. And Crescendo was owned by Gene Norman, who had a late night radio show in LA, played jazz. And he also had the Gene Norman Presents label. And he had put out the Dizzy Gillespie at the Shrine Auditorium, big band record, which I loved. And he had put out the first Clifford Brown Max Roach record, which I loved. And he was like my dad, famous, at least locally, radio voice. He had a wonderful voice. And of course, I meet these people later on in life, and they'll say what an influence my father was on them. It was pretty nice, to have that association. But it was really my sister and my mother who I think were more instrumental in my career. So my dad would take me out to hear music and stuff, and he knew everybody. So within 5 minutes of coming to a club, we'd be sitting with the band.
I love that, sitting with the band. I have it from an inside source that you used to be known as the Bebop newspaper.
Where'd you hear that? It was started as I think it was, I don't know, it could have been Dick Whittington, my piano player friend, another part of our clique. Dick, or it was a piano player named Marty Harris that I played with a lot too, and he used to call me Dick called me the bebop Walter Winchell.
Oh, well, an acquaintance named Art Bailey gave me that little
Oh
insight.
yeah, that's cool. I probably told Art that.
Yes, yeah, I think you did. Did you have did your goals change as things went along? Because you went to the other end of the country to play with Gary Burton, or I'm not sure I'm correct about that, but you relocated. Is that correct?
I did.
Yeah. And then after a few years, um, you went to the Poconos. Was that
For a year.
for was that a financial decision, artistic decision, or?
More of a lifestyle decision.
Mhm.
We had lived in California. I grew up there. I lived in my old neighborhood, and we had a house. And I got to New York, and we didn't have a house, and I was married and had a child, and we're just doing sublets or staying with friends and all of that. But then we got to be, I was doing well on the gig, and I knew we were going to hang for a while, and came out to visit a friend I had already made in Los Angeles, I'm sure you know about, Bob Rowe, the singer songwriter
Yes.
and producer. And Bob and I had worked in L.A. together, backing up a folk singer named Chad Mitchell, and we had become really good friends. And also his partner in that was a guitarist named Stuart Scharf, and we all became very, very close friends. And Bob was like an older brother to me, not like a mentor so as much as a guy who just really, really liked me. We got along great, and he started, hiring me and all that stuff when I wasn't, on the road with Gary. And I came to visit him in Pennsylvania, in the Poconos. I'm hiccuping for some reason. Ooh, excuse me. And we just loved it. So a year after we moved to New York, almost exactly to the year, January of 1970, moved out to the Poconos, and I've basically had a place out here since then. It's like 55 years.
What was a typical gig in the Poconos like at that time?
Typical.
A typical gig, a typical.
Gig. Well, I wasn't working in the Poconos really much.
Oh, okay.
I would work some local gigs occasionally, and they were pretty lame. But then I got in through Bob. I met musicians who had, decamped to Pennsylvania. It was Jay Cameron, the baritone sax player, owned a music store on Main Street in Stroudsburg. And Bob Newman, saxophonist from Philadelphia, was the band leader at a resort. Yeah, so I met those guys, and we started, jamming and playing together. But mostly I was playing with Gary, and then and traveling. And at their last year with Gary, it's probably, let's see, 69, 70, 1971, and our business had just fallen apart. Rock took over, and they didn't. We used to play colleges, and all of a sudden we weren't playing colleges anymore. They spent all the money on one band for homecoming instead of 5 bands.
I know exactly what you're talking about because I was in college right around that time, and the scene for jazz was great in colleges, and then it wasn't.
This is the first record that I bought for myself was Dave Brubeck, Jazz Goes to College.
So the next step after Gary Burton, did your calendar get filled up like in a hurry?
Oh, I was doing commercial work in New York, gigs and recordings. I was working on the Schoolhouse Rock series with Bob. Every time I played on, the great preponderance of the tracks are me on drums.
The great what?
preponderance.
Oh yeah.
I'm on most of them. Been into like a wordy phase lately, using bigger words. I don't know why. So the senility of some kind. But yeah, was doing that, and I was doing quite a bit of other recording, some jazz recording, and I played a lot with. Well, I played at the Mount Airy Lodge with Bob Newman's band for a year after I left Gary, and that's where I met Steve Gilmore, who later was the bass player with Phil. I introduced them. So I love playing with Steve, and we had a really great band at Mount Airy Lodge. We played, all kinds of music. Played a lot of rock and rhythm and blues, dance music. We also played jazz, and we had jazz players in the band, and we'd have jam sessions, and we'd back up some big acts. People tried to hire me out of there, and me and Steve together because we were a very good team.
Is Steve
Playing
playing?
just about any style of anything.
Was he playing electric bass for?
He would from time to time.
Yeah.
He played the stand-up bass mostly, but then he had the electric, and he could play it very well.
What's your preference?
My preference?
As far as
a good bass player.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if they could be playing a watch.
Doesn't matter what he's playing. Okay, what makes a good bass player?
Well, beautiful time feeling that can negotiate the odd sensation of playing with me, I think.
Can you
somebody you can groove with? It's such to really work with it with some bass players. I could always play easily with Gary, Peacock, Red Mitchell. We had to work at it for a while, but we stuck with it, and eventually we became very, very good together. Then I fortuitously moved across the street from Leroy Vinegar in the Hollywood Hills, and he befriended me, and then I played with his group. So I was always playing with really good bass players, or as much as I could. But after I played with Leroy, it's like I could get that feeling without the feeling you got with him. I could get with other bass players, which is saying something because he was just such a rock man of a wonderful, a wonderful beat. And it's always been the thing for me is the beat, the way the bass and drums combine. To me, that's like the beautiful part of the music. That feeling is very energizing.
Is there such a thing as playing on top of the beat or behind the beat without changing the tempo?
Of course. Well, you've heard about the big beat, right?
The big beat, yeah.
But I'm thinking about the beat, so it's not like this. It's like this, right? So the bigger it is, the more you can subdivide and put stuff in there. But it starts before the beat and it ends after the beat. If that makes sense. It's like you breathe, 1, 2, 3, 4, a 1, 2, a 3, a 1, a 2, a 3, So it's like the upbeat, which is the downbeat. I was soaking up the influences. I found drummers that I really, really liked, and I would, frankly, emulate them and steal their stuff if I could. You really can't. I could play all of Roy Haynes' licks, but I would never sound like Roy. But if I saw Roy or Art Blakey or any of those guys in later life, when I got to know them, and I would quote their licks to them, they just loved it. That became like a funny thing that I like to do, and it's my whole. It was pretty nutty, man.
Well, your
a lot
students,
of humor.
your students probably would do the same thing with you. Try to.
Well, most of them were too young to even know my oeuvre, so to speak, or what they knew about me, and I was on the faculty of a jazz school, so I was certainly well known, but I wasn't like, Jack DeJohnette or, Tony Williams. So they were all, I think that, I remember first teaching in the college of William Patterson, and I asked somebody who their favorite older drummer was, and they said Tony Williams. So Tony Williams, that young guy, he's like 4 years younger than me. So he's not an old master yet.
Right.
They just think it old. These are people that think jazz started with John Coltrane.
Yes.
That's pretty normal.
Or Michael Brecker now.
The things that led up to that.
Yeah.
As Max Roach pointed out years ago when he was being complimented for his innovations on the drums, he said, "I'm just standing on the shoulders of those who came before." And I firmly believe that. And I try to pass that on. And hopefully they get it. These guys have like so much ability on the drums at their age. And they're like teenagers, like I was. But they're in school, but they can really play the drums, whereas I had to learn to play the drums and I was already a professional musician.
Do you have words of advice for them as they graduate and try to make their way in the business?
Well, I tell them if you could do something else, it's probably a good idea to do it and then play for fun. Because the business as such is nothing like it was when I started out. I can't, really advise them too much about what's happening today. Though I do know the process of getting involved in music and becoming, a player and a known player is still the same. It's social. It's, it's a drive you have for whatever reason. Probably not money, probably not money or fame, but that you just love the music as I did. And, you find a way to do it. But all my students, if they're not full-time musicians, are doing something. They're teaching. They start their own labels. They, there's so many different things that they can do. They just, they paid a lot of money to go to college for 4 years, and they end up with a degree in jazz performance. And I say, what are you going to do with that? You go down to Smalls and show them your document. Can I sit in? Here's my my BFA. And they think it's funny, but I'm sort of not kidding.
Right. Probably mom and dad are asking the same question.
You got to go play. You got to meet people.
So let me ask you about producing a little bit.
Sure.
Did you get into it? I'll just say on purpose. How did it occur?
Well, it happened because I joined Phil Woods' band, or we joined. It was really like a cooperative band. For some reason, we played really well together. An original quartet. And Phil had his manager at that time, who was also his record producer. And the guy was an accountant, and he knew nothing about music, but he'd still tell you how to play. And I had been thinking about it. I say, well, that guy can do that. I could do that gig, and I could make 10 times what I'm making on this record date, like he is. I was making $100, he'd be making $1,000. So I figured, well, I could do better than him.
Who's paying?
It wasn't an audiophile, but I really knew how records were made. I'd been hanging out in the studio since I was a teenager, and hearing these great musicians, and I was no stranger to that part of the business as far as being a musician. But the producer was quite often not really very musically inclined in a way, but they were businessmen. I mean, the classic guys, the Bob Thiel and the Erdogan brothers and so forth. Lester Koenig was a great model for me from contemporary records, and I had befriended him because of my friendship or he befriended me because of my friendship with Art Pepper. I used to go to contemporary studios and had witnessed recording sessions. I remember taking Art to a session he was doing with Marty Page. It's called the Great Jazz Standards or something like that. It's about a 10-piece band. Wonderful record. Art plays tenor, alto, and clarinet on it. And Marty's arrangements, marvelous.
I bet you were soaking it all in.
I was
Yeah.
soaking it all in. I was, like the fly on the wall, very big fly on the wall.
Warren Keep News, I asked him if he had a definition or philosophy about producing, and he said he described as being a catalytic agent, creating a circumstance where an artist can work most effectively.
That's a good way of putting it. But what it really boiled down to me was being able to relate to musicians and to the business of music. See, for a long time, I didn't relate to the music as a business. I just did it and I made money at it. I wasn't that aware of the greater music business. But then when we were working with this producer, with Phil, and then they had a big falling out because it turns out the guy was padding the budgets and keeping the money. He's basically stealing. And he's dead now, so I won't defame him any further than necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you mentioned he might be making 10 times more than the musicians, and I'm wondering who's paying the producer. Is it the record label?
Well, we were on RCA Records, so he was getting big budgets for us, and he was spending half of the money and keeping the rest.
Mm-hmm. So now you're in the producer's.
Found out and got rid of him.
Yeah. So now you're in the producer's chair, and you are dealing with the budget.
Didn't happen overnight. Used to get friends together to record. We had friends in the studios that had engineer friends and stuff, and be able to get in the studio after midnight and record for free, and then do things on spec, things like that. And I started taking more control over that, and I got to just know it better. But then when Phil's producer was no longer a producer, I had been recording our group when we were on the road. I had recorded several hours of performance at the venue in Austin, Texas, called the Armadillo World Headquarters. Great venues, mostly like rock and Western swing and country music, Texas music. But they had jazz groups there. We had a great booking agent. He would book us in places like that, and they loved us there. And they had a recording studio behind the stage, and I recorded the band for, twice, I think, in subsequent years, maybe 78, 79. And I had these tapes. They were beautiful, beautiful sounding tapes. The guys were wonderful engineers. Direct to 2-track live recording, which became my trademark. It was, old school recording, which is, I'm from that school.
No overdubbing allowed.
Well, I had them, and we had been dropped by RCA. We did not have a record deal. I had the tapes, and somehow word got around about them, and these two small labels, one was in Baltimore, one was in Washington. They called me, and they wanted to do a thing with two albums, and I had enough for material for 2 LPs. So they split it up. One took one, the other took the other. Phil Wood's Quartet Live and more Live, they were called. The first records that I got production credit on. And we went from, I was able to negotiate, a fairly nice, budget for those. They were already recorded, and I hadn't spent a lot of money recording them. So I was able to get, probably a total of maybe 15 grand for both of them. And then the next thing that happened was Ron Goldstein from Island Records called me, because I had met him when he was with Warner Brothers Records. And he was starting president of Island Records subsidiary called Antilles Records. It sounds like you're Antilles, but it was Antilles, like the Lesser Antilles.
Yeah.
And we had talked about, he couldn't sign us. He liked us, but he couldn't sign us to Warner Brothers. But in any case, he called me and said, what do you do? What's happening with the group? I said, well, we're available. He said, well, I want to sign you guys for a couple of records. So we did, and those paid. The first one paid 13,500, and the second was 15,000. So, and I negotiated that. And then the guys in the group started to think maybe Bill really knows how to produce records. I had the gift of gab, man. I could like go in, got to know these people, and I started hanging with those people. I got to know presidents of record companies and agents and promoters and all of that. And I was an active player, and I was producing one of the great jazz groups, which I happened to be the drummer in.
Did
So
you
another fortuitous circumstance.
do you think your how do I describe what you listened for changed as your role expanded?
What I listened for? No, my values stayed the same. And they were established very early in my listening habits. I like that, I like mono and simple stereo recording. Multi-track recording I have no problem with it. Digital recording, I have no problem with it. But all I'm really interested in is what ends up on those two tracks.
Did you ever have any disagreements with engineers?
Not much. Occasionally, and I'm pretty direct about what I want to do. I had like really good engineers that liked my playing. It worked like a lot with Jim Anderson. He's a great engineer. He recently was teaching at NYU at the Tisch School. In fact, he started their whole like recording program there 25 years ago or something. And he was the engineer for Jazz Alive, which was based in D.C. And he recorded the Philip Group live several times, and I really liked what he did, and I liked him. And we became friends. And I had a friend in Pennsylvania who ran the engineer in a little studio called Mountain Sound. His name was Chris Fischera. He eventually moved out west. He's still out there. Been out west for 40 years now. But in the beginning, he helped me put together those two LPs because I had the tapes, but I needed editing, and we had to do some couple of interesting things that you don't really talk about what you do so much because people think they know things and most of them don't. But I had to use my understanding of the music and the technology to editing and so forth. It's to cut tape with a razor blade. So
I recall the first time I saw that, I was stunned that such a thing was possible.
You didn't know?
I didn't know until I first did a session or something, and I saw the engineer do it, and then put it back together, and like, wow! I remember he used to listen. He would turn the reels, and he'd listen for the bass drum, and there's the spot.
Yeah. Well, we got really good at that, and both those guys were great. But I also worked with I could work with any engineer who was competent, and there are plenty of those.
Did you like to see the bass being recorded in a certain fashion, the acoustic bass?
Well, yeah, I like several different things. And one would be just a stereo, pair of mics. This is the way Manfred Eicher did everything with everything in stereo. Two mics on each horn, two mics on the bass, and then more mics on the drums, of course. And I had seen him do that in the studio. And I'm trying to think now. I like this natural sound of the bass. Not all basses sound the same. Not all bass players hear their bass in the same way that I do either. For example, when I was doing a record, Tom Harrell record, and I had hired Charlie Hayden for it. And Charlie loved to dominate the sound. And so the record came out, it was a very nice record. then I ran into him club somewhere. I said, "You hear the record?" He said, "Yeah, bass isn't loud enough." I said, "Listen, man, it's not your record. It's Tom's record, and I can hear every note you're playing." So,
Yeah,
plus he can't. Charlie couldn't really read, and he was really roughing it off there quite a bit.
I
We,
see. I remember that.
but I think it might have helped. I know the music was fine. There was one called Form. It was also on Contemporary Records, as a matter of fact. I got to, it was owned by Fantasy at that point.
Hmm.
And I got to record a bunch of Tom's records for them. And then later the Chesky brothers, Chesky records with Tom. But, Paul Motion and Charlie, Danilo Perez, early recording of Danilo, wasn't even 21 yet.
Oh my.
And yeah, he was pretty great, man. I just love that guy.
Do you have memories of I got different categories here. Best gig ever, worst gig ever, most bizarre um, circumstance getting into a gig and getting home, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but mostly I can't remember that stuff.
I know what you mean.
It has to do with alcohol and drugs, possibly, or bad intentions. So I don't know. It's all been. I can't think of stuff that was really awful, but there were funny things that happened. Like when I was playing with Jerry Mulligan at a club in New York. When I worked with Jerry for a couple of years, after Gary's group broke up, I played a lot with Jerry. I played with Al Cohn and Zeus Sims. Went on with Stan Getz for a little while. I was playing a lot of gigs. And Bobby Hackett. I mean, it's just gigs in New York mostly. Sometimes on the road, like Chicago or someplace. I think I went to Detroit with Stan, Chicago. Oh, I was touring a lot of work with Mose Allison. We had recorded in L.A. with Red Mitchell on bass, and he really liked my playing. So when I moved back east, we hooked up, and I did a lot of gigs with him. So I was working, quite a bit, and all with people that I like. And I remember some funny things, like after not playing with Mose for a decade, and he called me to do some gigs, and I went down to Philly to do a gig with him and played the first set he played of tunes we had recorded, and I remember them all. So it was good. It was, really sounded good. Because, he didn't rehearse. So the second set, I couldn't find one. I had no idea what was going on. It was all new music. Afterwards, Mose did a thing which he never used to do, which is he says, let's go to the bar and have a beer. He would usually just pay you and leave. He didn't hang out really. For some reason, he took pity on me. He said, I see you were having trouble there on the second set. I said, yeah, man, what the hell is going on? He says, I probably should have told you about my new concept. I call it anti-time. Anti-time. I said, yeah, you probably should have told me. we remained good friends, and I did play with him more later. But it was at one point in the '70s, we were playing all the time, all over the place, and we're going on an opening for. We did a concerts opening for Bonnie Raitt, which was really great, and I got to know her and her guys in her band, and then Bonnie and her band introduced me to Tom Waits, the person and the idea, and then he hired me to do his record with Nighthawks at the Diner. So I flew back to L.A. to do that, and it was all my L.A. buddies, Jim Huard on bass, Mike Melvoin on piano, and Pete Chrislieb on tenor. So it was like, he didn't know any of that. But his producer, Bones Howe, knew me because we were friends. And Bones is also a friend of Bob DeRose and Leroy Vinegars. So, I called him, actually. I heard Tom Waits. I just loved what he was doing. It was wonderful. So I called Bones. I knew he was the producer. I said, I just met Tom Waits, and I don't know, I just have this feeling that he told me he's going to record soon. I just have a feeling I'd be good for the record. He said, that's funny because he just told me the same thing earlier today.
Oh,
Grace
that's
had called
very
him and said he
nice.
wanted to get me on the record because he heard me with Mose and he really liked my play.
Nice.
So that was that. You know, that,
Did Bones Howe pass away?
uh,
Did is Bones Howe? He passed away, didn't he?
I don't know.
I I was trying to track him down because
He would be
I
in his
used to
90s
see his
probably.
name on a lot of things, Fifth Dimension and all kinds of
Yeah,
things.
he became the producer. He's a very good producer, a great engineer. He engineered the first Ornette Coleman records on Atlantic Records, the ones they did in L.A. They did two for Contemporary, then he did two for Atlantic, and Bones engineered the Atlantics once. And it's a great guy, also a very good drummer.
Have you been in a situation as a producer? This might be more of a pop thing where you had to really hype somebody up to get in there. You can do it. You can do it.
Well, occasionally, mostly some real old guy who's, out of his gorge. I think without defaming him, I think there was a session I did pretty early on in the 70s in my producing career, or early 80s, I guess, was Phil Woods and Lou Tabakin. And the rhythm section was me and Michael Moore on bass and Jimmy Rolls on piano. And Jimmy had left home in L.A. and moved into New York and was living with Carol Sloan, the singer, and had gone on the road, had taken the gig with Ella Fitzgerald. So he was traveling with Ella, and I called Carol to see if Jimmy would be able to do the date we had in New York, and it turned out to be fine. But he had really just gotten back, so he shows up and he's half lit, and here Phil and I are walking down the street, and there's Jimmy with some police. He's pointing at us. He's looking for the studio, and he can't find it. He's pointing at me and Phil, going, "Those are them. That's them." We're like, "Oh shit!" We're gonna get busted now. But no, it was fine. But he kept trying to resign, from the date. He was tired. He played beautifully, but he actually played. We played one tune without him because we finally just had to let him go. I had chemical means of keeping him awake, and we used that until it didn't work anymore.
I've often wondered about that. Sometimes you'll see a record where it's a quartet, except for one song that's a trio, like
Yeah,
no chordal instrument. And you think, oh, that was very experimental for them, when in fact, probably the piano player just had to couldn't finish.
maybe more experiential. It Yeah, it happens. Those are scenes where get prepared to do a recording, and I like to do live recordings a lot. And there was one we were going to do in New York at a club with Phil, and I had all set up. We had a really great relationship with Bruce Lundvall in these last years when he was at Blue Note. We became very friendly over the years, and I wanted to do a. We had done. I'd done some records for Bruce for Blue Note, but I hadn't done Phil's group. I said, we do something with Phil. He thought that maybe that was a good idea, but he didn't know. So anyway, we were going to do a thing at this club in New York called the Iridium, and we're going to have the quintet with Brian Lynch and Phil and Bill Charlap, Steve Gilmore, and myself. And then we had a guest, Bob DeRoe, and John Gordon, the young alto player. And so we were doing this gig, and Bruce was coming down every night to hear it. He still hadn't given us the deal, but he was coming every night to hear it. I know he was thinking about it, thinking deeply about it, probably. And then we were getting ready. The day we were going to record, Phil decided he didn't want to do it. And he didn't have a good reason, but, it was Phil Woods, the record. What are you going to do? He didn't want to do it. He had a dispute with the club. See, that's the thing with Phil, was he could be a real loose cannon sometimes. And he didn't have the slightest, much of the slightest idea about what I did. You know,
I see.
and I preferred that. You think that maybe he was more, important than he really was in that regard.
Hmm.
I see no reason to him not. Plus, he was my brother-in-law at that point. So
I had
my
a nice
sister introduced
conversation.
me to Phil.
Yeah.
I'd never met him. I'd seen him play. I stood next to him at the Newport Festival, but I never met him. And all of a sudden, he comes to my house and lives with me for 2 months with my sister. And that's when we started the group.
Wow.
The people, how'd you hook up with Phil? I said, well, he showed up at my front door and I opened the door. I said, hi, I'm Bill. He said, hi, I'm Phil. And then, 3 months later, we started the band.
Yeah. I had a nice chat with him at the Deerhead Inn years ago. It was a real fun for me. For one thing, he had a good Cannonball Adderley story and all kinds of things like that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I knew Cannonball. He was a great man, a wonderful man.
Among the other people that I was going to ask you about was Joe Williams, because
Oh, yeah.
he helped get this project started years ago and was a very dear
No, I
friend of
thought
the.
that
Yeah.
was he, did he go to college there? He was from
No,
Chicago.
he did not. He befriended a fellow named Milt Phileas, who did go to college here, class of 44. And Milt Phileas was a tremendous jazz fan and supporter, almost like a patron.
Uh-huh.
He got to know Joe. And so around 1993, they decided that too many musicians were passing away without getting their stories told.
Mm.
And so we started this project, and Joe lent his reputation to it. He did some interviewing for us, and he received an honorary degree from Hamilton College. And
Another beautiful person.
yeah,
I got to work with him for a few weeks in the 60s. And he wanted it was that trio of Jim Huart and Mike Melvoin and I. And we went up to Seattle and played, and we did some radio up there, which was later released as half of an LP. But anyway, Joe loved the trio. We loved him. You know, he was so great. Once we, settled in together after a few nights, man, I just felt like going home every night. And he was so great that I would see him after that, and he would always tell people that he really loved my playing, and that I played things in his charts that weren't written in there that he had written in there because he liked them so much. Just little things. Question and answer type stuff. But man, what a beautiful cat! What a great artist. So much fun to play with him. And it's like I get to play with a lot of great people. Shearing also, I think, was magnificent artist. I played. I loved playing with him, and I would have stayed with him if Gary hadn't called. Except I had gotten an inquiry from Kenny Drew in Copenhagen through Red Mitchell about me coming there to play with him and Niels Pedersen. So I had these two. It's like, what should I do? Move to New York, go to Copenhagen. Well, I had never been to Europe at that point, though Red had already moved, and Mitchell, that's why he recommended me. And so I took, and I always wanted to move to New York. New York, you're in LA, you go to New York, play the big game, get validated. I got over that pretty quick. But I don't regret it. Don't regret it at all.
yeah, I'm
That
here.
was because of, speaking of bass players, because of Steve Swallow. He just kept mentioning my name to Gary. He said, Steve and I were friends. And he said, Bill Goodwin would really like to do this gig. He's often said that to me. So Gary called me up. He says, Swallow keeps mentioning, we're looking for a new drummer. Roy Haynes. Roy Haynes is leaving the group. Would you like to audition for the gig? I said, yeah, I would, man. It'd be great. So he sends me a ticket. I fly back to New York, and we go to his house on Long Island. Swallow comes out on the train, and we play one tune. The tune was Falling Grace, which I had never heard before in my life.
You had not heard it.
I had never heard it. And so I played it, and I guess they liked it because I played one tune on the audition, and then we played another one for fun, and I got hired.
That's very interesting because I just listened to it this morning because I knew that was part of your story.
Yeah.
And when I was
How do you
listening
know
to
these things, Monk?
when I was listening to it, thinking of how that was for you, and um, I can imagine it was a challenge.
Well, not really.
Well, I thought
It's
it
the way it was
was.
supposed to be. To me, it was like, well, I'm here. I'm going to get this gig. You know.
It's a good attitude.
Well, yeah, I've pretty much always had that. Always had that. There have been instances where I was pretty sure I wasn't going to do so well, and I would turn the gig down, which I'm sorry that I did. Now, one was to play the Leonard Bernstein Mass, and that was because of Chuck Israels, another bass player, who was always recommending me for stuff, and so this is what it is. I knew that it was just kismet, right?
Yeah.
And the phone rings, and I've had so many offers, say really good paying, good gig offers that I had to turn down because of joined Phil's group, and right at the same time, Marty Morell left Bill Evans, and Bill called me. I was the first drummer he called, and I went and played with him for about 10 days. He offered me the gig, and I turned it down.
Steve Gilmore said that he thinks he missed some work because people thought, oh, well, he plays with Phil Woods. He's not going to be able to do anything else.
Well, Steve was very busy before he was working with Phil, doing Broadway shows, subbing, and playing with a lot of people. And he, it could be, but I just had to make that choice because I always wanted to play with Bill Evans. That was a band that was traveled all the time, and that's what we were getting into with Phil. And that was a band that was nobody knew really. We started to get well known. We started to get gigs, and it was like something that you get an opportunity to start something from square one and make it happen. It turned out to be 40 years. I mean, that's pretty good, man. Yeah. But I turned out the only guy to have turned down Bill Evans, Horace Silver, and Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
the touring band?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're all my friends.
Interesting. That's so interesting.
They recommended me, and I went and auditioned for Herb Alpert. He said, "Well, you could have the gig. You could certainly do the gig. I want you to move back to LA." I said, "No, man, I'm not going to do that."
Well, from Herb Alpert to all these people, it's amazing. One last thing, and I don't know if I can formulate this question so that you could try to answer it. Does jazz have a role in society now? I feel like it used to, and I'm wondering if it still does, in your opinion.
Well, I would always ask you what you think, but I think that as long as people love that music, they're going to want to play it. It's not about the bread or any of that. I mean, there's plenty of opportunities in commercial music to play good music, but to play jazz, especially the stuff that I like, which is straight ahead jazz, bebop essentially. But I don't just play bop, but we played good bebop with Phil, and that was fantastic for me. That I knew all that repertoire, and then when we got to record and tour with Dizzy Gillespie with the quintet, it was a highlight of my life. Dizzy had been my idol since I was about 13, one of them main idols, and to get to know him and to work with him was great, and to have the friendships with all these great players. It went beyond playing together, but it involved playing together. It involved, knowing each other, hanging out, and doing fun things. Wish I could remember more of it, but I think it will always be there, man. I really do, because as long as people want to play it, we'll play it for fun for ourselves. We'll get together and play. I play one night a week at the Deerhead Inn. So jazz outpost that's become more well known, especially because of the Keith Jarrett recordings, which I produced, by the way.
I'll close with sort of what you're talking about. Quote from Phil Woods. He says, some couple comes up and says, we were married to Round Trip, or your music means so much, those kinds of comments. Believe me, I'm honored to get prizes and all that. But to have the music mean something to people on that level, you can't buy that, man. It ain't for sale.
I agree completely. When you're on the bandstand, you're playing sincerely. It's almost like you have a covenant. You've established a covenant with the audience where you're all in it together. And I'm as much of involved in that. I'm part of the circle. They're the part of the circle. We're all there together for if not the same reasons, we're all there together to, involved in the same thing. And if you get approval from that, it's good. You're going to do it anyway, but it just makes it better when you're doing it with other people, and that kind of, it's a social music. It's a dance form. It's the thing that people forget now. I think a lot of the young people said, you're supposed to be able to dance to this, even if it's a weird sort of dance, should move you to want, it should inspire you to want to move. And, so I know I like something, man. I started involuntary movement.
Yeah. Well said.
Do a lot of this kind of thing.
Yeah. And you've developed a sense of humor over the years as well.
Oh, I'd say, yeah.
Well, thanks for your time today, Bill. This has been marvelous.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to a learned person like yourself.
All right. I'll pause here and we'll have our goodbyes.
Okay, so it'd be nice to be in your archive.